Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. James Lyonsweiler coming to you from the WWDNYK studios in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Today I have a very important report, a review, an educational session, doesn't matter what you call it. I'm here to share with you information about the accuracy of COVID-19 tests, specifically because people in the public, people in government, in positions of government are making decisions. They have very definitive opinions about the role of testing and about what test means, about the number of cases, about whether the number of cases is going up or going down, about whether the number of cases reported is real or not. And I just want to slow things down here for a minute today. It's 11/13/2020, and I want to give everybody the equal background on diagnostics, how to evaluate diagnostics, and break it down for you. And I'm definitely going to give you some recommendations and 2 calls to action today so that you can take charge of this and get some control over what I see as an out of control diagnostic situation. It's absolutely out of control. It is unfathomable to me as a scientist that we are where we are. Those of you that are new to Unbreaking Science, I have video after video after video showing the evidence that the FDA has dropped the ball, that the CDC has dropped the ball, that we're not doing it right, that we're not getting it anywhere as close to right. So I want to break this down for you, and so you can see what I can see when I look at the problem. So I put together some slides for you. COVID-19 test, how accurate. We will begin. The goal is here to educate the public so that they can become conversant on the issue of COVID-19 test accuracy. I hear all the time that the tests don't mean anything. That's not technically true. That's yes or no. That dichotomizes it. The tests mean something, they don't mean something. They do mean something. But what do they mean, and how good are they at meaning that? I provide a highly critical analysis of the testing programs, and I offer a simple solution. Here's some of the terms we're going to go over today. We're going to go over prevalence. That's misspelled. I apologize for that. We're going to go over true positives, false positives, true negatives, false negatives, sensitivity, specificity. We're not going to talk about positive predictive value. We're not going to talk about negative predictive value. We are going to talk about accuracy so that you know numerically what we're talking about. To understand how to evaluate diagnostics, you have to understand truth tables. A truth table works like this. If a person is infected, and the test results say they're infected, they're given a label of a true positive. That's a person who's truly infected. They truly have the virus replicating in them. The test result says they're infected. The label is true positive. If a person is not infected, that is, they do not have the virus replicating in them, then the test indicates that they are infected. That is a false positive. Okay? That's a bad call. If all the false positives that occur increase the case number, because the diagnostics is based on the presence of a test result, not the presence of a virus. Okay, the test result may or may not reflect the presence of a virus, but we'll get into that. Another truth situation is that a person is infected, and then the test result says it's not infected, so they missed it. That's a false negative. Okay. And another true situation can be that a person is not infected and the test result says not infected. That is a true negative. So the 2 types of errors that we see here are false positives, people who are infected, some people who are not infected, who the test results say are infected, and a false negative where the person is infected and they say that they're not. We're going to focus mostly on the false positives because that's the most serious part of error that can be made in this current situation. So a way to organize this is to compare the truth in this truth table. It's a 4x4 table. It's not complicated. It's very straightforward. But this represents exactly what I was just talking about. If you truly have the disease or the condition and the test says positive, that's a true positive. Okay. I have animations here. So that's the A is a true positive. The animations are not going to work in this format. So this could be a disaster. Let's see. The test positive, if you have no disease or condition whatsoever, then the test is positive. Then you would see if you have no disease or condition, the test is positive, then you get a false positive. Okay, so that's what's happening there. You have a disease or condition, and the test is negative, that's your test negative. And if you have no disease or condition, and you test negative, then that's a true negative. All right. Okay, so we're going to use the following labels. If a person is infected, and the test result says that they're infected, then the label is TP for true positive. If a person is not infected, and the test result says infected, the label is FP for false positive. If the person is infected, but the test result is not infected, then the label is false negative, FN. And if a person is not infected, and the test result says not infected, then the label is TN. So there's some math that has to be considered here. All right, it's pretty simple math. What we're looking at here is the truth table, again, in a different configuration, where we have the truth being you have a positive case or a negative case, and the prediction by the test is positive or negative. So there's your true positive labeled in the true positive quadrant, your false positive labeled in the false positive quadrant, the false negatives label is in the false negative quadrant, and the true negative. Got it? Okay, so the false negative, the false negative is also known as a type 2 error. So if you're going to say that there's no disease present, but the truth is that the person is infected, that's also known as a type 2 error. If you have a false positive, that's also known as a type 1 error. You're saying that the virus is present when it's not. So you detected something that's not truly there. All right, so on this chart right here, this is how, for any diagnostic that uses some continuous variable of a range of some measurement, tells you the difference between the healthy and the diseased, if you will. And the cutoff value of the test, the problem is that oftentimes the variation in the population that you're measuring actually overlaps. And the cutoff in the middle there is a cutoff that's supposed to be optimized, is supposed to be determined using empirical means. They're very powerful ways that I know of to actually optimize testing in molecular testing, radiography, radiology, molecular tests of all different kinds. So there's usually a cutoff, and that means that there's a trade-off between the true positives and the false positive and the false negative rate, basically. So, but if you look at this, this diagram implies that there's as many healthy people as there are diseased people. Right, that is equal. There's 50% prevalence of the disease, right? And so then this is just to demonstrate that there's, where the false negatives are in the diagram and where the false positives are in the diagram. If you have the healthy population on the left, that entire distribution as a frequency distribution of the measurement that's supposed to be used for diagnostics, then the individuals that are beyond the test threshold who are healthy, those are the false positives. And the area under the curve there tells you the number of them, or if you think about the areas as equaling 1, it's the proportion of false positives of the healthy. And so the entire population, of course, is made up of all the people in both curves. But the false negatives then, of course, are those in the disease that fall below the cutoff threshold for diagnosis. All right, and so that little area of false negative represents the risk. And in this situation, because the test is right in the middle and there's an equal risk of a false positive and false negative, this test is balanced, it's optimized. Okay, let's look at the next one. So the ability of a test to detect a virus when it's present, when it really truly is present, is called sensitivity. All right, so the sensitivity of a test ranges from 0 to 100% or from 0 to 1.0. The factors that influence those include that you have viable reagents, that the kit's actually working, that you have it's properly designed, so you have a match of primers to the target in the case of RT-PCR, that you've appropriately selected the correct CT threshold. This is the count number of the number of cycles before, when you detect something, you say, okay, this is probably present. If the number is too low, you're not going to detect enough cases. If the cycle number is too high, you're going to detect if the cycle number is low, you're going to detect too few cases. If the cycle number is high, you're not going to detect enough cases. And because there's a trade-off with the accuracy, inaccuracy in terms of specificity trading off with sensitivity, which we're going to define in a minute, changing that CT threshold changes both sensitivity and specificity. As you can see, if we go back one slide, if I change this cutoff value back and forth, I'm going to change the false positives and false negatives, and I'm going to change the sensitivity and specificity accordingly. Another factor that can influence the ability of the test to detect the virus when it is in fact present is lab hands. Okay, so whether a person has good lab hands or messy lab hands, whether the lab is careful or not, and the FDA has actually shut down a few cases, laboratories, but not for sensitivity, not for the miss rate, not for missing cases, but for specificity, for finding too many. There were laboratories that were finding 100% positivity, 100% positive results in all the samples. So in terms of the CT threshold, this is a nice diagram that shows, in terms of the cycle number, the arrow on the right, if you increase the cycle number, you can see that you're going to have too few cases that can possibly achieve that threshold. So what's happening here is the sample itself, as you amplify the PCR, in the PCR reaction, you amplify the replicons or the target molecules, then you should see an increase. There's an exponential phase there. It's not very well represented here as truly exponential, but there's an exponential phase here. And usually the CT threshold is going to be right in the middle of that exponential phase. Here it's a little bit lower. This is going to be a very highly sensitive test. So in a PCR test, you should have a sample, and you should also have a control of no template that doesn't amplify anything. And that no control template has to not amplify anything every time. If it's amplifying anything, especially if it's in the weight range of the SARS-CoV-2 amplicon, then you're in trouble, because you could confuse a false positive amplification of something else that looks like SARS-CoV-2 and not know it. It looks about the same molecular weight. If you have contamination of your kits, you're going to amplify things both in the control and in the sample. When CDC shipped out their original tests, they actually found that there were serious problems where the test kits were not working. Reading the reports, I did not find people say that the control sample was amplifying. What I found is that the test just wasn't working on people that was really clear that had coronavirus. So that's a false positive. They spun it as a problem that the test was too sensitive, which was baloney. There's some serious problems with the CDC's public image right now as a result. The virus got out of hand, and we had to shut down society allegedly to deal with that. But nevertheless, the point here is that the cycle number, as the cycle number increases or decreases for the threshold, the CT value that you see there, you're either going to get fewer cases, right, as you go to the right, or you're going to get more cases as you go to the left. All right, in terms of where you put that CT. So this is part of the design of the kit. Here, I just wanted to isolate, the true positives and the false negatives, because they actually relate to each other in terms of specificity. So here we have the truth is that the person is infected, and the test can either say yes, they're infected, or no, they're not. And if the test says that no, they're not infected, that's a false negative, because the person actually does have the disease, the infection. So sensitivity is defined as the true positives in that quadrant, the TP, the number that are true positives, divided by the sum of the true positives and the false negatives. So that's very simple. Sensitivity being a ratio of the true positives, how many people, what proportion of people who have the virus are actually detected. So that's how that works mathematically. In the AAU applications, the FDA approved tests based on the ability of test kits to detect viral sequences in samples to contain viral sequences, known to contain viral sequences. That means that they did have empirical estimates of sensitivity. But some were reference samples that were labeled SARS-CoV-2 by unknown means of validation. So if you used some gold standard, and the gold standard wasn't 100% accurate, then if the gold standard, say, was CDC's flawed test at the beginning, then what are you optimizing towards? You're optimizing towards a flawed test, and this is a very well-known flaw in diagnostics. Let's say that you are using a gold standard outcome like a test in radiology radiography, I should say, to validate a biomarker. No, you need to know the actual clinical course for each patient in your study. So using proxy outcomes like a gold standard of some other molecular test does not give you 100% accuracy in the field. And some labs, like the German lab that put out the PCR test in January, actually spiked samples with synthetic oligos of target DNA to make sure that they could get the amplification when that oligo was actually present, but it wasn't. In some of these cases submitted to the FDA, it wasn't RNA, which may be more difficult to amplify. On the other side of the equation, if we just look at the people that don't have the disease and we look at the test predictions of the positives and the negatives, the false positives are the ones that are called positive, but they don't have the test, and that's a type 1 error, like I said. And then the people who are negative and they're predicted accurately to be negative, those are the true negatives, all right? Well, specificity, like sensitivity, is defined as the proportion of wrong calls in that column. So the right calls in that column. The specificity is the true negatives, that is the TN quadrant, divided by the total number of people that fall into the FP and the TN. So I'm going to make these slides available so you can see the animations. You can step through on your own and rewatch this. So let's go through some of the factors that can influence specificity. Specificity is defined as the ability of a test to detect the virus when it is in fact absent, that is not present. So it's an error. This also ranges from 0 to 100% or from 0 to 1, depending on who you're talking to. You could do it either way, but if you report specificity 0 to 1, you should also report sensitivity 0 to 1. So the factors include contamination, that you have a contaminated kit, okay, that you have somehow you got SARS-CoV-2 virus in your kit. I don't understand how the CDC possibly could have shipped contaminated kits around at all. There's no reason to have a contamination unless they were shipping true positives, positive controls, which is of the actual virus or segments of the virus. Then so the contamination can occur, but another factor is match of primers to the host or to other pathogens. So if I'm a human being and I'm being tested for a virus, and the primers actually match my genome sequence, I could get a false positive read. Now the chances are pretty low of this, but it's non-zero. You do get some partial amplification if there's a match between a virus. Match between the primer and the virus, as well as one primer and the human genome somewhere. It's unlikely, however, that you're necessarily going to have a matching primer. But in multiplex testing, it's possible that you can have primers that were not intended to be matched that could then false amplify part of the human genome. They can also amplify other pathogens that might be present. And of course, the other factor that influences specificity is the CT threshold. So, and of course, lab hands as well. If you have bad lab hands, you can have bad specificity. So, given that we know that the specificity is estimated in the lab before you release it, it should be estimated in the lab before you release it. It's worth pointing out that there's a difference between lab specificity and lab sensitivity and field sensitivity and field specificity. Those things could be very, very different. The lab conditions are often much more perfect. The samples are more pristine, and other reasons. So now you're going to catch me using the phrase false positive rate, and you should understand what that is. If we have specificity being the probability of the test to detect a virus when it's not present, then the false positive rate would be 1 minus specificity. So FPR is equal to 1 minus SP. Remember that SP is equal to the true negatives divided by the false positive plus the true negatives. So the false positive rate is the false positives divided by the false positive plus the true negative. The false positive rate is what we're going to focus on here, because the numbers are just exploding in unreal ways. For an ideal test, just so you know the range, the sensitivity should be 1, the false negative rate should be 0. For an ideal test, the specificity should also be 1, and the false positive rate should be 0. I'm not going to go into the ROC curve today. It'll just confuse people for what the purposes are. It's not necessary. Here we have that diagram again with the cutoff value, with the negative calls, the positive calls. This particular diagram implies 50% prevalence. And this represents the number of persons that are healthy and diseased. Both distributions together account for the entire population. The people who are above in the abnormal range, or beyond the CT threshold here, they're going to be diagnosed whether they're healthy or diseased, because the threshold is a threshold. You're going to end up with false negatives and false positives of about equal number. But that's not the situation for coronavirus. There's not 50% prevalence for coronavirus. Even though they talk about the huge number of cases per day over a given week, the average prevalence in the population throughout the entire outbreak in the United States since January has been 3.5%. So we're looking at 50% prevalence just for the ideal. Like this is how the test, to define the terms here. But with the low prevalence in the United States being 3.5%, we have a very, very different diagram to look at, and I prepared this for you. This is what the diagram looks at, okay, at 5% prevalence, that little red distribution. And what you can immediately surmise in that little red distribution is that by far most of the errors made in the testing scenario, if you're doing widespread testing, will be false positives. Okay, look at that. I'm going to bring that up close here. Look at that. There's a tiny, tiny little number of false negatives. In fact, in this situation, there's no false negatives. And people might argue, well, that's where we need to be, Jack. We need to be there so we don't miss any. I'm not sure that that's true, because you have to compare the cost of the false negative to the cost of false positive, and no one has done that except for me. And I've only done that in a theoretical framework. My work on that is under peer review, but I'm going to share some of the results of that today. So with 5% prevalence in the situation where the diseased people represent 5%, this is what this looks like. Most of the positive test results by far are going to be false positives. This is just math. This isn't anything to do with agenda. This has nothing. This is true for any diagnostic. If you only have 5% prevalence, and this is where your cutoff is, and so people would argue, well, then you should turn your cutoff. You should increase the CT threshold. If you increase the CT threshold, then you'll get fewer false positives. The argument goes, but then they say, well, you got to worry about the false negatives. Well, you're going to get into the false negatives there. So there's also a problem with PCR, that if you just amplify things too much, you can get something called push-through, where you get what looks like amplification that's not there. So that's a well-known artifact. So the FDA did not require estimates of specificity for the emergency use authorization for RT-PCR kits from the testing companies. I checked this out in real time. I was in contact with the FDA at the time. I expressed my concerns over this at the time. In the EUA applications, the FDA approved tests just based on the assurance that the test manufacturers said that the PCR primers did not match the host and did not match other pathogens. That's a computational comparison using an algorithm called BLAST. It's a bioinformatics study. It's not an empirical study. It's not an estimate. They didn't run the sample on just sputum samples from people that did not have coronavirus, just like the Germans did. The Germans did it, But most of these tests were approved with zero empirical data demonstrating the SARS-CoV-2 specificity. So these tests, any number of them, and there's lots and lots of tests, any number of them could be amplifying off-target sequences. Okay, so given that we have the possibility of these false positives then, and it's more than a theoretical possibility because now there's some data which I'm going to share with you what the false positive rate is. Given that we have this, then we have to be concerned both about sensitivity and specificity, especially given society's reaction to the test. Well, let's talk about different testing strategies. And I think I jumped ahead here. Yeah, in testing strategies, you can have discriminate testing and indiscriminate testing. Discriminate testing is symptom-based. So a person is coughing, they have a lung problem, or they have something that the medical community considers a potential symptom of coronavirus. Then they're tested. That's symptom-based. Another discriminant type of testing is that the person that is being tested was in contact with a confirmed clinical case. They had a positive PCR result. The PCR result was confirmed, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, about how to confirm a PCR test, and the person had symptoms so that they had a clinical case of COVID-19. Here, I disagree with the CDC 100% on how they define a clinical case. The CDC's guidelines say that a clinical case of COVID-19 is a presence of a positive test result. This is extremely unusual, right? I've heard people say that Kerry Mullis said that the PCR test should never be used for testing, yada yada, all of that. That's not what he meant. When he said that, what he meant was PCR is step one towards testing. Yes, you can have PCR towards viral testing. We're going to get to that again in a minute here. But indiscriminate testing is where you just screen everybody in the population, or you just do random testing, right? So if you do random testing to try to get the positivity in a result, you should never clinically act on those random test results. You should never say, oh, here's these positive results, so now these people have COVID-19. No, it's a separate purpose. Now, people can make the argument that it's unethical to tell a person they don't have the virus, that they might infect. But I will convince you by the end of this presentation that if you do random testing just to get positivity, because most of the cases are going to be false positives, you're just setting a bomb off in your community, in your city, in your college, in your state. You're shutting down businesses. You're causing loss of jobs, and so on and so on. You really have to be careful with this. Another indiscriminate type of testing is where you're doing contact tracing, but the person's only suspected of having COVID-19. And that's going on, and that needs to stop. That absolutely needs to stop. And we're going to empower you guys on how to help make that happen. So it's really clear that more testing is not always better. The more testing you do with the indiscriminate situation where the false positive rate is so much higher than the false negative rate, well, people can argue that, Jack, you need a utility function. You need to be able to relate the cost of the false positive, the cost of the false negative, and no one can do that. Baloney. We can simulate that all day long, making under certain assumptions. We can assume that the cost of the false negative is more than the cost of false positive. We can assume that the cost of the false negative positive is more than the false negative. That's what I've done. I have a paper under review right now under the wide ranges of extremes of those cost functions. It's trivially easy to do. It's just arithmetic. It's very simple to do. And that research is done, and I have the firm opinion to share with you based on what I've seen in that research. And I hope you give it some consideration. So there are some empirical estimates of the false positive rate. The field false positive rate of the test looked at by Basile et al. In 2020 was 11%. 11%. That's a far cry from the 1% or the 0% that's assumed to be the 0% that's assumed to be in play, given that the primers don't match the host pathogen, and the primers don't match other, the host genome, and the primers don't match other potential pathogens. If you see an empirical estimate, this is field estimates of 11%, we're in deep, deep, deep shit. 11% is huge. My original theoretical configurations on the cost, my studies were just based on 1%. and it was still led me to the conclusions. Now we have 10 times that or more. 11% false positives. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's maybe very much worse because Dr. Singhang Lee published a study where he analyzed the reference samples that are being used to validate PCR tests to determine in the samples that were labeled to him. This is the gold standard reference set. If I was to develop a new PCR test today, they would send me a reference set. The reference set would be samples that are labeled SARS-CoV-2 is present in this sample. They say it with 100% certainty. Why? Because they use some type of gold standard determination. They also send me another set of samples that have no SARS-CoV-2 in it, and it's guaranteed to have no SARS-CoV-2. So try to explain Dr. Lee's findings when he actually amplified and sequenced SARS-CoV-2 sequence out of the reference set that came to him labeled no SARS-CoV-2. Worse than that, it's not laboratory contamination on his part, because one of the sequences that he did amplify was a new variant that was found in New York City, and that's the location where those reference samples were shipped to him in Connecticut. I did a whole interview on him on this. I had no idea it was this bad until I reviewed his paper and interviewed him. It's 30%. So it's worse than just here's this test kit out there and it has an 11% or 1%. What's if they're shipping out reference sample sets that are mislabeled? This is a hot mess piled on top of a hot mess. Okay, so we're looking at just fundamental, elementary aspects of getting diagnostics right for molecular diagnostics. So that was a 30% false estimate, false positive estimate. Well, guess what his false negative estimate was? It was 40%. So 1 out of 4 of the samples that came to him were mislabeled. Okay, now you can say maybe it's a conspiracy. People didn't want his lab to get a contract, get an EUA, whatever. Doesn't matter. He's an objective scientist. He's confronted with the data. He submitted it for peer review, and it's out there. I'll share it with you. So here's the reference: Bacil et al. Accuracy amidst ambiguity, false positive SARS-CoV-2 nucleic acid test when COVID-19 prevalence is low, 11%. This is Dr. Lee's Business Wire. He was on the show. I'm going to have him on the show again. CDC coronavirus test kits generate 30% false positive and 20% false negative. I misquoted that. Sorry, it wasn't 40% false negative. It's 20% false negative result. Connecticut pathologist newly published findings confirmed. Business Wire 7/17/2020. This is some time ago now. We should have this crap under control. This is Dr. Lee's publication in the International Journal of Geriatrics and Rehabilitation, Volume 2, Testing for SARS-CoV-2 and Cellular Components by Routine Nested RT-PCR, followed by DNA sequencing. And that's the key here. That's the key to everything. Okay. Cost of the false positives, huge. $16 trillion. Over 50% of restaurants that have closed are going to have notified people months ago that they're going to remain permanently closed. There are deaths due to hospital closures, undiagnosed cancers, missed life-saving surgeries, job loss, suicides, deaths of despair, social upheaval. Why? Why? I'm going to go back to this. You have to see this again. You have to see that. For that. Because of that. Right there. The false positives dramatically outweigh the false negatives when the prevalence is low. Dramatically. I said it in Harrisburg when I gave my presentation. I wish I had these slides with me when I gave it. We're blowing up our own society from the inside out. Every false positive is like a little hand grenade thrown into our economy, thrown into people's lives. It needs to stop. Absolutely needs to stop. This the axes aren't even labeled here appropriately, but this is the results of my simulation study under different assumptions of the cost of the false positives being much less than the cost of the false negatives, and the cost of false positives being much higher than the cost of the false negatives. And what you can see here, what this represents are the number of people that are affected by false positives and false negatives together. So this is the total cost. So this is a utility function like exercise that says, okay, what's the total cost of society under these conditions? When the cost of the false positive is much greater than the cost of false negative, then when you do indiscriminate testing and you do a population screen, you're destroying your own civilization. That's just you're done. You know, and the egregiousness of the fact that people argued against any treatment that might work, argued against EUA, like Dr. Fauci, argued against EUA for hydroxychloroquine, in spite of the massive amount of data that's available now, the massive amount of studies at c19study.com. It's unfathomable that this is anything other than agenda-driven. This is NIAID in the United States does not conduct science. CDC in the United States does not conduct science. When the cost of the false positives is much less than the cost of the false negatives, you can still see that there's variation. What the different color bars represent is variations in the level of testing, from low testing to high testing. What this shows is that my result in this publication that I hope will come out soon is that there's 44% more variation in the total cost to society in terms of our management of the cost of the false positives and the cost of the false negatives. In other words, how we respond to coronavirus is much more determining of the total cost than more or less testing. The variation for more or less testing is the same, regardless of the cost of the false positives and the cost of false negatives. But the total outcome really depends on whether the cost of false positives is greater than or less than the cost of false negatives. Okay? So this slide, I'm definitely going to have to share with you every aspect of this. But when we have lockdowns, the cost of the false positives is much, much greater than the cost of the false negatives. That's clear. That's absolutely clear. If you're going to lock down a city, lock down a college campus, if you're going to lock down a town, if you're going to lock down a state, you're destroying your own community. If you look at group quarantine, so there's a group of people like at a college, and you go to quarantine, say a dorm, the cost of false positives for them is greater than the cost of false negatives. Okay, but to society, we'll have to see. In contact quarantine, where you're contacting people who are not confirmed, then the cost of false positive is still greater than the cost of the false negative. If you have confirmed clinical contact, the cost of the false positive is still more than the cost of the false negative, but not so much. Now, interestingly, if you do confirmed clinical contact where the person had the disease, they had the symptoms, they had the test, and the test was confirmed, the PCR test was confirmed by Sanger sequencing like Dr. Lee does, then you could do self-monitoring. And then the cost of the false positives equals the cost of false negatives by my estimates. And if you take no action whatsoever and you just let the virus rip through the population, the cost of false positive, that's the only condition under which the cost of false positive is less than the cost of the false negative. But we can handle that if we know how to treat the disease better. So there's some serious problems with diagnosis of coronavirus. I don't want to review them. It's very important because it's more than just the test false positives. There are other false positives. Because currently, we learned from Dr. Ely, under CDC guidelines, a case of COVID-19 can be symptomatic and test positive. It could be asymptomatic, no symptoms whatsoever, never developed a single symptom, test positive. It can now be asymptomatic and test negative simply because you were suspected to have been in contact. There are states that are reporting that as a case. You could be unexposed, untested, regardless of symptoms, and you could be called a case. And I'll show you that in a moment. Remember, this is the situation because the prevalence is so low. When you do the testing and when you start doing indiscriminate diagnosis, regardless of the test results, then you're in trouble. Then you're in serious trouble. You end up doing some really, really, really bad things to your community, to your society, to your state. Okay. This is Dr. Ely's paper that shows that the CDC changed their diagnostic criteria for reporting cases of COVID-19 without going to the proper authorities. They may have broken the law. That's the conclusion of this, published in Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law. Okay. Now here I have, I jumped ahead to some recommendations here. Sorry. Here I have a list. I'll make these slides available. I'll put the link to the slides here in a little while. But here's the other types of false positive COVID-19 cases. You've got your asymptomatics. You've got your allergies, asthma, bronchitis, COPD, influenza, RSV, SV, bacterial pneumonia, and other coronaviruses. That's what that list reads. All of these clinical conditions, unless you test specifically for that condition, even if these conditions like asthma, bronchitis, are going to be called comorbid condition. And we didn't get a positive test result, but we better make sure that we call it a COVID-19, because more COVID-19 cases means what? I've been told it means more money for the hospitals. That's what I've been told. They're selling us out, folks. Absolutely selling us out. So here's Dr. Ely's paper. Okay, here are my recommendations. I'm sorry it doesn't show up on the screen because I forgot that the animations don't work in the software. But I say that you should require the sequencing. I agree with Dr. Lee. Require sequencing of all PCR products in the size range of the COVID-19 target. Unless you see the Sanger sequencing result and it validates and it maps to SARS coronavirus, that test does not count. That test is invalidated. Report confirmed clinical, symptomatic, and test confirmed cases only. That's what a clinical case is. You don't have the disease simply because the virus was present. You may have inhaled it 2 seconds before. You may have already cleared yourself of it, and it's just on the way out. Okay? Contact with confirmed clinical cases, you should just watch for symptoms and only be tested if they become symptomatic. Don't overtest the population. If you do overtesting, you're going to destroy your civilization. We need, in the same time, to protect the elderly and those who are truly at highest risk of coronavirus serious illness. We have to do that. Okay, how do you do that? Let's have that discussion. Stop testing everybody and destroying everybody's lives. Let's protect those who are at risk, absolutely. And we need to revamp public health in the United States to focus on Th2 skew in the immune system. We don't need to do further vaccination and make our Th2 skew worse. We need to make it better. We need to find out ways to stop hurting our immune system, because the people who have a hard time with COVID-19, it's protecting the elderly and those at risk starts with stop making them sick. It absolutely starts without making them sick. A further recommendation that I have here is to allow in-home private testing if the test is 100% sensitive and is 100% specific. So that's going to be an RT-PCR test that the result gets sent away for rapid sequencing. That's a must. We have to restore HIPAA privacy over COVID-19 status because we're blowing up our society. One person, one city, one school, one business at a time. It's ridiculous what's happening. So here's what you can do, and I'm going to definitely make these available to you. What you can do, and I'm sorry that you can't see it, the animations don't work. I want everybody to consider creating and signing a petition in your state to demand sequence evidence of SARS-CoV-2 test results. Every test, every time. In your own state, make a petition, right? Do that today, do that this weekend, make a plan right now, put it in your calendar. Create a petition and circulate that petition. So in your state, it's required that the SARS-CoV-2 PCR product is sequenced every time. I want you to call and write to the FDA and demand empirical field estimates of the false positive rate. Empirical, not theoretical. Empirical meaning real data. Field meaning not in the lab. Out there in the clinic. Send this video to your congressional representatives, state and federal, and to your senators, state and federal. You can email Timothy Stenzel. I've been in contact with him. He thanked me at the beginning when I found a problem with the PCR primers of CDC's test kit. I found high homology, a match to a human sequence. He thanked me at the beginning. When I started asking him about false positives and telling him I was concerned about false positives, he stopped responding to me, so maybe he'll respond to you. Timothy Stenzel, timothy.stenzel@fda.hhs.gov. He's the FDA diagnostics chief. He's in charge of all this. Demand gold standard Sanger sequencing, demand release of reference samples, that should say reference samples, not references samples, reference samples to complex laboratories. Use that language specifically, like Dr. Lee's, the ones that are going to do the sequencing. They have refused, and I've read the letters where the FDA is refusing to provide reference sample sets to laboratories that will sequence them. Unacceptable. That needs to be reversed. You can also email Secretary Azar, secretary@hhs.gov, and demand a return to the pre-2020 reporting standards for cases for COVID-19. Demand it. Demand updates to counts to exclude unconfirmed clinical cases. If you were tested, got a false positive test, throw out everybody that didn't have symptoms. Every last one of them that didn't have symptoms. All those numbers need to be thrown out. Okay? Sorry about the typo there, but demand updates to count to exclude comorbidity cases that enlists COVID-19 as secondary causes of death. Well, what we want to do here is throw out all the cases that had high comorbidity, high risk of death already, throw them out, update the numbers. We need a total revision, 100%, turn it in the other direction. Stop scaring people. Stop freaking everybody out over this. We know what the rates of death are for most healthy people. Now, how can you support WWDNYK? You can do it at Patreon. We have very few supporters, actually, for all the work that we do and everything we're putting out. So I'm calling on everybody to get behind Patreon, get behind WWDNYK. We stand for What We Do Not Yet Know Studios. I'll leave that up there, patreon.com. It's very important that we get that, because the funds that are raised by this are used to boost these videos and social media to inform more people. So go for it, and let's get some funding behind this initiative, and do your own thing too. If you do create a petition and you want to share it on my personal webpage, James Lyons Weiler, on Facebook, fine. Send it, share it to my page, please. It has to be done soon. So put it on your calendar. I'm asking everybody to put it on your calendar to do something up to make sure that the false positive rates are known, that the false positive rates are given their due consideration, and that we stop over-testing. We're hurting ourselves. It's the worst thing that we could do in this situation, in my view. All right, so with that, I'm just going to close out with a great big thank you for everybody who's involved in discussions with me on this. Whether you have the same opinion or not, I appreciate it. Well, critical discourse, rational critical discourse, is much needed in this country. It is being killed by people who don't want science, who want full-time control over your perceptions and marketing, and they use science-like activities to market what they're doing. So I want to thank you all. Here you go.
In this episode, we're going to review the evidence that science is broken. This is not a true story.
The truth will be told, people will know the price of corporate science really taking its toll. Whistleblowers blow, public health data low. They say the science is settled, but how do they know?
Science.
Ask questions, critically think, you should try it. It's pure, unadulterated science. I'm breaking science.
I'm breaking science.
You can't deny it. You sure can't buy it. Fact check, use your brain, don't be quiet. It's pure, unadulterated science. I'm breaking science.
I'm breaking science.
Using the tools of the trade to back up what we say. You can't be silent when it comes to unbreaking science. Let's light the truth up, next level ultraviolet. You got a hypothesis, do a critical test. Make an observation without being biased. Use logic and reason mixed with evidence. Look for patterns and results with significance. Calculate them numbers, real accurate, or else your findings won't be legit. Don't cherry pick, but be skeptic, cause broken science, it makes us sick. That science is being funded by the very same people that run it, so they can promote a product, so they can make that money. Try not to laugh, cause this ain't nothing funny. All these science-like activities, no joke, they call them studies. Hand-picking sample groups and no true placebos. Losing public trust the more and more that we know. The truth will be told, the people will know the price of corporate science really taking its toll. Whistleblowers blow, public health data low. They say the science is settled, but how do they know?
Science.
Ask questions, critically think, you should try it. It's pure, unadulterated science. I'm breaking science.
I'm breaking science.
You can't deny it. You sure can't buy it. Fact check, use your brain, don't be quiet. It's pure, unadulterated science. I'm breaking science.